One of the most entertaining stories to tell in wrestling is taking two seemingly dissimilar performers and pairing them up in order to create magic. Yes, it really is true that sometimes opposites attract, and there are few places where this has been proven more than in the wacky world of professional wrestling. But who are the best of them all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into Oil and Water, wrestling's greatest odd couple tag teams. And if we're going to start off anywhere, why not do so with probably the most famous example of an odd couple tag team in wrestling history? And that's when Ultimate Cool Guy The Rock teamed up with everyone's favorite freak, Mankind, to create the Rock and Sock connection. Of course, on the face of it, this one should have flopped spectacularly. After all, who could have imagined that the two people who were so far apart in terms of character could ever mesh well together on screen as partners? And when you take into account the fact that they'd also been longtime rivals by the point 1999 came around, there really is no way this should have worked. But work it did, because on the August 30th episode of Raw that year, seeking an ally to help him take on The Undertaker in The Big Show, Mick Foley went looking for an old enemy. And that led him to The Rock, someone who'd turned babyface since the last time they met on screen, and who Foley now felt would be more likely to stand by his side. That said, while he did do this, as the weeks went on and Mankind tried to keep their relationship going, the People's Champion appeared to have no interest in such things. Now, as far as he was concerned, the man courting him just wasn't on his level, and being seen with him only dragged the Great One down as a result. And as time went on and Foley began to wear down his prospective partner, The Rock eventually softened towards him enough to the point where he agreed to team with him again. That then would lead to them not only becoming tag team champions on 3 separate occasions, but also putting on what was at the time the highest rated segment in Raw history when Mick Foley hosted a very special edition of This Is Your Life for his partner. And while they would have their ups and downs after, whenever one needed the other, they were always there for them, as was the case when the pair teamed up again to take on the McMahon-Helmsley regime in early 2000, or even when they had a brief reunion in 2004 to face off against Evolution at WrestleMania 20. But with this match marking the last in-ring appearance of Dwayne Johnson for 7 years, it meant that by the time he did return, the Rock and Sock connection would be no more. That said, it wasn't like WWE weren't still creating great odd couple teams around this point, because just 1 year later in 2012, one of the best modern-day incarnations of the trope was born when Bryan and Kane formed Team Hell No. Yes, like The Rock and Mick Foley before them, the idea of pairing up a Michael Myers-esque monster and a vegan hippie from Washington might have felt counterproductive at first. But when Vince McMahon decided to put them in anger management classes in the summer of that year, it instantly created something special. Why was this? Well, most WWE fans had seen some degree of comedic chops from Kane by that point, they'd never really seen the same thing from Bryan. So, during the course of those segments where the two learned to put their anger aside and hug it out with each other, the American Dragon got to add a whole new layer to his character, all while Kane was making himself relevant all over again. And when they decided to tenuously begin partnering in the ring following this series of skits then, fans were all in on the idea. But while Bryan might have preferred the idea of calling them Team Friendship behind the scenes, in the end, it was the fans who settled on naming them Team Hell No instead. Either way though, regardless of the name, the selling point was now how well they'd worked together inside the squared circle, as by the time that September's Night of Champions came around, they'd have been able to dethrone Kofi Kingston and R-Truth to win the WWE Tag Team titles. And while they would eventually lose those belts to The Shield, it didn't stop them from continuing to partner together over the months which followed. In fact, the only reason they ever stopped teaming at all wasn't because of a big fight between the two. No, it was because by mid-2013, Bryan had gotten so popular with fans, he was being moved up to the main event scene of the singles division. And while he certainly earned this spot through his years of hard work in the likes of Ring of Honor, there's also an argument to be made that, without Team Hell No getting him over with the kids, he'd have never made it as far as he did under Vince McMahon's watch. But not all odd couple tag teams end with one person reaching the next level, because sometimes both people are already in the highest rung by the time it begins. In fact, sometimes these partnerships come at such a late point in each man's career, it really is more of a bucket list moment for them than anything else, as was the case when Roddy Piper teamed with Ric Flair for a while in 2006. Now, for those who aren't aware, despite being bitter rivals on screen for much of the 80s and 90s, off-screen, Piper and Flair actually had a lot of respect for one another. So much so, in fact, that the Nature Boy has even been known to gush about how much of a fan he was of Roddy during his early days in the industry, with the Canadian in many ways being his hero. But this should come as no surprise, because during the territory days and into the Golden Era, there was no one who played a more effective heel than the kayfabe Scotsman. Hell, even Flair himself, who many consider to be the greatest of all time, saw himself as being lesser by comparison. So when during the twilight run of his career during the mid-2000s, he got a chance to team up with his idol, he jumped at the chance. And given how much of a legend Flair was by this point too, Piper was only too happy to get involved as well, as that November's Cyber Sunday, fans voted for them to team together in order to challenge the then World Tag Team Champions, the Spirit Squad. And proving they still had some gas left in the tank here, the Legends were able to come out of this one with both the win and the gold around their waists in order to start their first and only reign on top together. But while this run wouldn't last for long on account of them losing to Rated RKO a week later, it still meant that they'd forever be intertwined in the history books, something which Ric Flair is no doubt very happy about. That said, they weren't the only Legends of the Golden Era who created an odd couple tag team in the mid-2000s. No, the very man who Piper faced off against at WrestleMania 1, in fact, Hulk Hogan, would also return to the company around this time and decided he wanted to get in on the fun too by pairing up with Edge. And like with Ric Flair's fandom of Hot Rod, this one was especially meaningful for Edge as he'd grown up an avid Hulkamaniac, so much so that he was actually in attendance at WrestleMania 6 cheering on the Hulkster when he took on the Ultimate Warrior. So when the Canadian came face to face with his idol on SmackDown in mid-2002, he instantly reverted back to being a child again as he did everything he could to impress the former 6-time WWE champion. And seeing this, Hogan took Edge under his wing as from there, the two started teaming up, with this eventually leading to them getting a WWE Tag Team title shot against Billy and Chuck on the July 4th episode of SmackDown that year. But what made the match which followed stand out even more for people watching was that, now fully inspired by his younger partner, the Hulkster decided to come out to his old Real American theme for the first time in almost a decade. And with the power of the 80s behind him, both he and the Rated R Superstar were able to overcome the incumbent champs, beating them to start their first and only reign on top together. That said, like with Piper and Flair, this one didn't last for long, as only 19 days later, they'd have dropped the belts to the Un-Americans. But even if it was short-lived, it was still a moment which probably ranks as one of the proudest in Edge's career to this day, because getting to team up with your hero, if only for a few weeks, is almost as good as a world title win itself. Of course, not all odd couple tag teams are about someone getting a chance to work with their idol though. No, most of the times it's still two contemporaries who find themselves pairing up in these situations. Not that this makes it any less possible one can be an on-screen fanboy of the other, however, as can be seen in the time Dude Love became the unlikely partner for Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, the Rock and Sock connection isn't Mick Foley's only time appearing in this video, but for some context as to why his reunion with the Rattlesnake was so special, we have to travel back to May of 1997. That was when, finding a common enemy together, Austin and Shawn Michaels joined forces to win the tag team titles from Owen Hart and the British Bulldog. But when HBK fell to an injury a few weeks later, Austin was tasked with finding a new partner or else he'd be forced to vacate the belts. That said, being the lone wolf he was, he'd repeatedly expressed his desire to not team with anyone else and instead defend them solo. This, however, was a lot easier said than done, so it's just as well Dude Love was ready, willing, and able to jump into the spot soon thereafter. Not that Stone Cold was welcoming of his help at first, though. No, like with The Rock a couple of years later, it took a while for the Texan to warm up to Foley. But over time, Mick's charms eventually got to him, and so, despite still feeling like he could do it alone if he had to, Austin relented and allowed Dude Love to stand in his corner. And that began a truly great odd couple pairing, as with the Rattlesnake being all about kicking ass and the Dudester being all about having fun, the two raised each other up as they went on defending those belts all the way up until the point a broken neck had finally forced the Texan to vacate. And this would also mark the end of their partnership too, because once Austin returned to the ring a few months later, he'd be targeting the WWF title. But while he was now riding solo once more, he'd still be there to help out his old buddy on occasion, such as the time he helped him to beat The Rock to win his first world title on the January 4th, 1999 episode of Raw. That ought to put butts in the seats. Of course, for as great of a feel-good moment as this was, however, by that point, a new odd couple pairing had risen up, so there was no need for Austin and Foley to start teaming up together again on a permanent basis. And as it happened, this new pairing also featured a second inclusion for someone in this video, as like he would with Daniel Bryan years later, Kane made an unlikely friend here in X-Pac. Yes, if you were a fan during the Attitude Era, you'll likely remember this one as a particular highlight because it was the moment when a favorite of outcasts everywhere, the Big Red Machine, finally got to show some more character outside of just being a horror movie villain. How did he do this? Well, by having Sean Waltman take him under his wing and be the first real buddy he'd ever had. Seriously, so much did the former Clique member push his new ally over the course of their partnership, Kane not only stopped using his voice box to help him talk, but he even got an on-screen girlfriend in the form of Tori. Basically, it all started when, after Kane was abandoned by both his father Paul Bearer and his brother The Undertaker, he'd spent a period lost in the wilderness. And while this was happening, X-Pac was going through something similar too, as he'd been turned on by his DX stablemates Triple H and Chyna. So with both needing a friend, they ended up being drawn to one another. And while Kane was at first hesitant to let anyone get close to him, Waltman eventually proved that he was being genuine, as over the weeks which followed, the two started tagging and even picking up a number of wins together. Hell, come the April 5th episode of Raw that year, they'd win the tag team titles from Owen Hart and Jeff Jarrett. And from there, their union only strengthened as they continue to defend those belts against all comers, usually by having Kane play the powerhouse and X-Pac play the high-speed cruiserweight in order to cover all their bases during their matches. Of course, once DX reformed in late '99 though, things started to change as X-Pac now had to reassess his priorities. And well, for a moment it looked like he may even induct the Big Red Machine into the stable as its newest member. In the end, he chose the heels as he turned on his former partner and then stole his girlfriend to add insult to injury. That's right, it was a sad ending for one of the best odd couple pairings in WWE history. That said, as always, once it reached its final chapter, there was another weird union ready and waiting in the wings to take its place. And this one turned out to be one of the best ever too, as it happened, because it featured none other than William Regal and Tajiri trying their best to get along. But how did this start? Well, after returning to WWF in late 2000, it wasn't long before Regal was made an on-screen commissioner. And considering how stressful his job was then, it's no surprise that he was soon allocated some help in the form of Tajiri. Given the cultural differences between the two though, combined with the fact that the Japanese buzzsaw could barely speak a lick of English, this one was played far more for comedy than other entries here. Yes, the sight of the Englishman getting increasingly frustrated as he tried and failed to give instructions to his assistant made for some fantastic laughs throughout early 2001. That said, for as many difficulties as they had communicating backstage, whenever they teamed up and hit the ring together, it was a different situation, because there they were speaking the same language, and that language was wrestling. So this would see them find much success then, and eventually even come to like one another, as they realized they actually made for a pretty good pairing. Not that such a thing was the reality behind the scenes though, because, as William Regal has since confirmed, the two, while cordial backstage, were never exactly buddies, as the Japanese buzzsaw did more to annoy the Englishman than anything else. But perhaps this was for the best in terms of their characters, because such a relationship was then able to bleed over onto the screen too, meaning that even when they were getting along, there was always a friction there which kept things interesting. And while there were no such backstage issues between our next subjects, that same sense of on-screen friction was what allowed them to be so memorable too. That's right, whether it be in backstage segments or in the ring, no team was more over between 2002 and 2003 than Booker T and Goldust. But wait, how did these two come together? Well, while Booker was always comfortable leaning into the more comedic aspects of his character, even he had to admit that he was the straight man of the duo, when during the former year, the Bizarre One began courting his attention with the offer of partnering up. Unfortunately though, at first, this courting backfired, as it more often than not led to the 5-time WCW champion losing the match he was involved in. And considering the fact that he was part of the WWE version of the NWO at the time, it predictably only served to upset his stablemates. So when Shawn Michaels literally kicked him out of the group a few months later, Booker T was left on his own. Luckily for him though, that wouldn't last forever because soon he found a friend in the form of an enemy when he began to reassess his relationship with Goldust. Yes, it was here that against all odds, the two formed a genuine bond. And with them now together then, Booker and Goldust regularly stole the show over the course of the next year. Whether this be in the ring where they won the World Tag Team Championships on one occasion, or during backstage segments where they were the funniest thing on Raw by a mile. So memorable were their skits in fact that even to this day there's still some of the things each man is most commonly associated with. And that bond allowed them to continue on strong together for a full year as they picked up win after win. But as with all good things, it had to come to an end eventually, and so it was that by the time Booker T was rising up to the main event scene in the spring of 2003, the two would mutually agree to part ways. And this makes them one of the rare odd couples who actually left things on good terms, something which we're not sure if we can't say about our next entry, Renee Dupree and Kenzo Suzuki. Yes, during the brief time the two were paired up in the autumn of 2004, they did manage to win the WWE Tag Team titles. Sure, you could argue that those belts meant little by then, but it doesn't change the fact that they were able to coexist, if only for a little while. And in doing so, they were able to prove all their naysayers wrong as they created a union between the East and the West that no one will forget for a long time, providing you're a hardcore fan of the mid-2000s SmackDown Tag Team division, that is. Unfortunately, however, once they lost the belts to Rob Van Dam and Rey Mysterio a few months later, it was also the end of their partnerships too, as now with no more gold to bond them, the unlikely duo split, with neither ever being seen together again at this point. But part of the reason for that was that each man would make their separate exits from the company over the year or two which followed, and this is also the same reason our next subject split up, something we feel is a shame because even if they didn't come across as obvious partners, Carmella and Billie Kay could have done something together had they been given more time. Yes, while most people associate Billie Kay more with her real-life best friend Peyton Royce, she was actually able to gel pretty well with the Staten Island Princess too, despite their apparent differences. And that was what saw them decide to pair up in the spring of 2021 after Kay had spent the weeks and months prior handing out resumes in an attempt to find some new allies. That said, even if they did manage to earn a spot in the Tag Team Turmoil match for the women's tag team titles at WrestleMania 37 Night 1, almost immediately after, Billie would be released from her contract. And this then put a quick end to the team, as now separated by companies, it doesn't look as if they'll be pairing up again anytime soon. Not unless Triple H breaks down the forbidden door, that is. But it's not only WWE that knows how to book an odd couple duo. No, if we venture over to All Elite Wrestling for a moment, we'll find one of the best unlikely pairings in recent memory in Orange Cassidy and Danhausen. Of course, part of the reason this one works so well is because both men are already so strange by themselves that partnering them up just further adds to the bizarreness of the situation. After all, with Cassidy's gimmick being that of a man who's incredibly talented but simply too lazy to wrestle properly, and Danhausen being a demon who doesn't want to act too evil or no one will like him, it's hard to find two weirder gimmicks in the modern day. And it's this very weirdness that has made them so popular with fans, and it's also what saw them become stablemates and the best friends once the latter joined AEW in 2022. Still though, up until recently, they hadn't actually directly teamed. No, while they are part of the same group, their first incidents of tagging together wouldn't occur until they entered a battle royal on the March 1st episode of Dynamite in order to earn a shot at the company's tag team titles. So perhaps it's fitting that they ended up winning this then, with the pair going on to compete at the Revolution pay-per-view for the tag titles. And even though they didn't come out of this one victorious, the sheer weirdness of their chemistry together means they've earned their spot amongst the great odd couple tag teams in wrestling.